Alison Cummins. I just realised it's not on the slide, and I'm from Sydney in Australia, and I'm going to give you a presentation today on the topic of my PhD, which is called Enabling New Graduate Midwives to Work in Midwifery Continuity of Care Models in Australia. So I've just got to give you a little bit of background about Australia. And I'm from UTS, and I'll tell you about UTS, University of Technology, Sydney. And the centre is called the Centre, the thing doesn't work, Centre for Midwifery, Child and Family Health. And that's similar to your MIRU, Maternal and Infant Research Unit. So that's the research unit that I'm from. So this is Australia. How many people have been to Australia? Okay, half. So you'll have some idea of the size. And this is Sydney, where UTS is. Now, what you need to know is that there's states. So there is New South Wales, Queensland, Northern Territory, South Australia, Western Australia, which is huge, Victoria, and also there is the Australian Capital Territory. So there is states and territories that have their own premiers, so local governments. And funding for health services is dependent on the states. So the Commonwealth government will give money to each state and say, spend it how you like. So then the states decide how much money goes into health and education, which are the things that we're interested in. So if you just get a little bit of scope, I just took the train to Plymouth to spend Easter with my girlfriend in Plymouth. It was about a 9-hour train ride. Usually at Easter, I would go to Byron Bay, which is here, which is a 10 to 11-hour car drive. So it's not that big a distance for me, but for people from small countries it is. This is Sydney. It's pretty picturesque. Apparently the whole time I've been away it's been raining non-stop, but mostly it looks like this. This is Manly Beach, my local beach, and this little pool here is a free swimming pool on the harbour in a place called Cremorne, where I go swimming every weekend. So that's just to give you a lifestyle shot. It's pretty nice living there. This is UTS, which is in the middle of the city, and this is the main tower building, which gets voted, it's brutalist architecture, and it gets voted the ugliest building in Sydney every year. So UTS has spent a lot of money on trying to make the campus sticky, that is, make students stay on campus. So they've built a whole lot of new buildings. This is IT and engineering, and that's pretty fascinating. And this one is a Frank Gehry building, and he's a famous architect. Germany, Netherlands, not sure. He's got buildings actually all over Europe. So that's called the Paper Bag Building, and that's sort of we're out there with architecture, I think. We'll see what they say about this in 20.
Alison has one in Dundee.
Is there?
Yeah, the Maggie Centre in Dundee at 9 Miles Design Zone.
Oh, I'll have to have a look. Yeah. And we call it the Chow Chuck Building, it's the School of Business, and the money for the building was donated by a Chinese businessman. So that's what it's named after him. UTS Midwifery is, I just want to give you a little bit of background. There are 2 programs to enter to register as a midwife. One is for registered nurses who do a short program after their 3 years of nursing, and usually do a year of practice, and then they do 1 year of midwifery, and then there's a Bachelor of Midwifery, which is a 3-year program. And so some of my research refers to their direct entry or postgraduate entry. So are mothers and babies in Australia different? I don't know, but here's the last national report for mothers and babies was in 2014, so these statistics are only for there. There were 307,844 women who gave birth in Australia. Their average age was 30.2. I was shocked. I thought it was 28 back then, but it's 30 years old. Majority, 72%, live in the cities. So if you've forgotten the map, I drew it over there. So Brisbane, so the east coast, Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne are where the majority of the population live. There's a few in Adelaide, a few in Perth, less in Darwin and even less in Alice Springs, and few in Canberra. 67% were born in Australia, 4.2% of all women were Indigenous women. So when we refer to Indigenous women, we refer to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Andrew, the map. The Torres Strait is just between there and probably Papua New Guinea. I didn't put it on there. It's very close above there, so it's the narrowest strait between Australia and any other country. So it's speckled with little tropical islands, and that's where the Torres Strait people lived, but also lived up in the Cape York, up at the top of Queensland. Yeah. Why they're important to count in our statistics is because the Indigenous women have the worst outcomes, more likely to have babies born early, babies of small weight, very unwell mothers. So it's important to talk about them. Babies, 51% boys, there's more boys than girls at the moment, and 5.3% were Indigenous. Why that's different to that is because Indigenous fathers can marry or have babies with non-Indigenous women, but their babies are counted as Indigenous. And we had a preterm birth rate of 8.6% in 2014, and that surprised me. I thought it was a bit less, I thought it was around 7, so it's quite high. Mean birth weight's 3.3 kilos or 3,000 grams. You use this here? Yeah, not pounds and ounces. What does maternity care look like? Most women, 99.9% of women had at least one antenatal visit. So that's really good because we know that that improves outcomes for mothers and babies. 95% had more than 5 antenatal visits. 98% gave birth in a traditional labour ward. Oh, by the way, I've worked in all these settings. That's what I wanted to say is my clinical practice. That's my old labour ward, which I had to manage and work in. This is the birth centre I currently sometimes work in casually. 1.8% gave birth in a birth centre, and it has a big bathroom with a lovely pool for water birth. And less than 1% had a planned home birth, and this is my friend Cheryl. She's an independent midwife and practices in private practice. So I've worked with her in home birth as well. The next bit might surprise you. 67% of vaginal birth, 11% of those are instrumental, so forceps and vacuum. 33% had caesarean sections. That's overall. And I didn't break it down, but I'll tell you a little bit about the private versus public setting. In the private setting, caesarean section rates are higher, so that's all of them grouped in together. And of those, about 18-19% are women who are in labour and have an emergency caesarean, and the other are women who have a caesarean without labouring. So hopefully for a medical complication rather than elected. And breastfeeding rates, I thought you might be interested. 96% will initially breastfeed before they leave hospital, remembering most give birth in hospital. Now, 39% exclusively, that's no other food or fluid for 4 months, but of that, 69% continue to receive any breast milk at 4 months. And 15% exclusively for 6 months, 60% of those will receive any breast milk. So our duration isn't great, but women keep doing it, even when they introduce other food and fluids. So breastfeeding is pretty good, and we know that...
Better than ours. You're saying that's not great and we're learning it off.
I know I have this in the back of my head. That's why I put it in. I thought, we have high caesareans though. What's the caesarean section rate?
It's lower than that, too.
Yeah. Alright, so midwives in Australia can work in independent practice. They work privately, and that means that they charge women a fee. So, for example, Cheryl will charge between $5,000 to $6,000 a birth. That's antenatal care, on call, 24/7, 365 days of the year, because she works on her own, unless she gets me to back her up occasionally, but I can't do that because I'm teaching. In order to do that, you have to be eligible, which means you have to do an interview and write a reflective piece that's submitted to the board, who are the registering authority, and then you're provided with a Medicare provider number. So then women can claim some of their fees back. The antenatal and postnatal care, they get 85% of the scheduled fee. And for intrapartum care, which is about $3,000 of the total price, they don't get anything back because there's currently no insurance for privately practicing midwives who attend women at a home birth. So you need to work really well with good evidence and make sure everything's safe.
But they're allowed to practice without insurance.
Yes, they are, and that is under a scheme between the regulatory authority and the government, and it's not forever. It was actually has expired, but they gave it another year, so they need to keep looking at that. We can't find any insurers. The last, I don't want to spend too much time, but the last case was a woman who had an epidural and the anaesthetist injected cleaning fluid instead of local anaesthetic into the epidural space, and she had a terrible outcome where she's had a very slow, painful, degenerative process of her nervous system. So the insurance company for that, which was in a public hospital, paid out $30 million. So they're saying the last case was $30 million, even though it's got nothing to do with midwifery care. It's like we have to have, that's how much it costs to get insurance. We have to be underwritten for $30 million. So
there's very similar issues here, but not to take up your time.
Okay, yeah, there's lots of things we could talk about. Okay, so that's less than 1% of the women, and we'll probably talk about that more because that's the most political way of practicing. Public hospitals, 70% of women will go in under Medicare and they won't pay anything out of their pocket. They can have team midwifery, caseload midwifery, or what we call midwifery group practice, which is usually 4 midwives working together, and that's what my PhD was about, my research, so I'll tell you about that. Less than 10% have access to this model. Then there's other models, midwifery-led just antenatal care, shared with GPs, and then there's core midwifery staff in the hospital, and there's privately practicing obstetricians. And women can go to a public hospital with a privately practicing obstetrician, and this is good for the public health system because their insurance will pay the hospital to have her. So that means there's money coming into the publicly funded hospital that wasn't going to come from anywhere else. So that's kind of good. 30% of women, around 30%, will go to a private obstetrician in a private hospital, and they pay a private obstetrician about $10,000 to $12,000 for their antenatal care, labour and birth, and up to 6 weeks after. And that mostly is covered with Medicare. Most they get, again, 85% back. However, they have higher rates of caesarean sections and much lower rates of breastfeeding. So the idea from the government reports is we want to increase midwifery-led continuity of care for women in Australia. So there's lots of evidence, and that's in here. So this is the title of my research, Enabling New Graduate Midwives to Work in Midwifery Continuity of Care Models in Australia. I have experience of supporting new graduates as they transition straight into midwifery-led continuity care. So that's providing care to women, usually from their first visit, which should be around 10 weeks, but it's often later if they go to the GP first, through pregnancy, be on call for their labour and birth, and up to 6 weeks, although in some of the publicly funded hospitals they don't get that long period in the postnatal. They just do the immediate week or 2 weeks of postnatal care, usually at home in the community. And it's from one midwife or a small group of midwives, and when it's compared with all the other models of standard care with GPs and hospital systems, it's found that it results in less caesarean sections and better outcomes for mothers and babies. So it's a good thing, and this is a strong systematic review that's updated every year, and we should be, particularly the bit that babies are born less prematurely, less likely to go to the nursery. Women are highly satisfied with this model. They like it, and in the hospitals in Australia where they offer it, there is waiting lists to get their own midwife. They really, really want it. And midwives have high levels of satisfaction when they know the woman. So it's a good thing, And why don't we have it then? Because about less than 10% of women in Australia, that's been estimated in a recent study, have access to midwifery-led continuity of care. The other thing is, one of the reasons we don't have it is because not all midwives want to work in that way. Midwives who work part-time, midwives who have young families don't want to work like that. Why we want them working in small groups is because then they can support each other, so they can have days off and holidays and sick leave, and then the second midwife or third midwife will be able to carry on with her caseload. So they care for about 40 women a year. That would be the top end, 40 women. So our midwifery students, so I'm a lecturer in midwifery at UTS, and our midwifery students in our curriculum have to complete 10 continuity of care experiences during their education. So they're prepared to provide continuity of care. We say this is the best model of care, so you should have experience in it. However, new graduates, when they finish, even though they might want to work in continuity of care, they're usually placed in a hospital and they have to rotate around different areas. So they'll work for 3 months on the antenatal ward, 3 months in the labour and birth unit, 3 months in postnatal, and then they might go back to antenatal or they might go to labour ward. So they find that they develop their skills in one area and then they get moved on. And then they develop those skills and then they've forgotten those skills. And they're not really working across the scope of practice. It's called and they're bunched in with nurses as well. They do the similar thing.